the candidates is not just round one and done, because today we got round two here for you. And speaking of for you, happy birthday to you, Ali Raza Firouzja. He just turned 19 today, and now at such an ancient age, honestly, he's pretty washed up. Not even sure why he's playing in the rest of this tournament. Seems like it's pretty hopeless for the guy. In all seriousness, though, we got an exciting day today. Nepo versus Fabi are two winners from round one. Naka can see if he's going to bounce back after yesterday's loss. And, as mentioned, Firouzja, did anybody get the poor guy a birthday present? Is he going to get to take some free pawns? Nakamura certainly wanted to come back with a win here against Radjabov. We saw another Berlin defense, this time though Nakamura on the white side, and he picks a different system than Fabi used to beat him yesterday, with an earlier knight d2. And the next sequence of moves definitely breaking some principles, but this has all actually been played, as weird as it may look, by a couple of top players, including Fabi, Nepo, and yep, even Naka himself has done this before. We do start to deviate here, though, with the move Queen h5, attacking the pawns, and here we see another example where black has the bishop pair, but the worst structure. So after Queen c6 to defend, now both sides develop, and here Radjabov finds an interesting move. He could have even played this idea earlier, but the point is to play d5. And even if he might be losing this d5 pawn, it's so important for him to activate this bishop. After a take, Queen c4, h3, trying to prevent the bishop from potentially coming to g4. Now bishop goes to d7 instead. Queen drops back. Over the next few moves is where Hikaru needs to come up with a plan for how to develop the rest of his pieces, because right now Nakamura might be up a pawn, but black has a huge lead in development. So how would you bring out the rest of your pieces? Well, here Nakamura goes with bishop e3. His idea is that he's inviting this trade so that his pawn on f3 comes towards the center and can push to help him in the center. Black has rook e5 to start attacking these pawns, and again, how would you continue with white? So Naka in the game pushes d6, but that allows Radjabov a few different options, such as queen d5 to try to trade off the queens and go after this pawn. Better would have been to play rook d1. Rooks belong behind passed pawns, and this would have allowed a setup with rook to d4 and bringing the knight out to d3 where it won't block the rook. And even though black could maybe take this a2 pawn in some lines, that's nowhere near as important as getting the pieces to help support white's own passer. So now in the game though, d6, now queen d5, and now rook d1, trade, take, rook d5, f6. So black has won back their pawn, but now, again, how would you continue with white here? Rook c5 was a very strong move by Nakamura, trying to activate this rook. After rook e6, rook c7, the pawns get traded, and now we're left even material. It doesn't look like there should be much for white here. And indeed, the computer does say this position is about equal, but if you compare the difference between the piece activity, you'll see that white still retains an advantage. With this rook on b7, it is much better than black's rook, because the problem is black's rook can't really activate here thanks to our knight on d2, and once the knight on d4, now the rook is totally blocked off. This knight's in the center, this rook's active, and this gives Nakamura a very pleasant advantage to play for. After both sides push some pawns, trying to gain space on the king side, black now brings up the king, white follows suit, and rook d5, now both sides start shuffling around a bit. Here, again, the position was equal, but Radjabov makes a mistake. And in all sorts of endgames especially, there's often a balance between whether you can sit back passively and just hold up to, curl up into a ball and just play defensively and hope that you'll survive, or whether you should go lash out for a counterattack and put piece activity over material. Here, Radjabov makes the wrong call, and he needed to play passively and sit back and wait to see how Nakamura would continue before deciding how he could activate his pieces. Because after rook d5, yes, he brings the rook out, but Naka's going to win this a6 pawn. And now that gives Nakamura a potential 3 versus 1 majority with a lot of passed pawns over there that he can look to push. So after some trades, Radjabov tries to go after this pawn, but rook d6, bishop goes back, more attacks on the bishop, and now bishop g4, the bishop blocks the rook's eye on that square. Now Nakamura trying to take yet another pawn, bishop c8, rook c5, attacking the bishop. This poor bishop, this poor bishop. Now finally knight f3 to defend the h4 pawn. Rook comes back, rook moves over, trying to prepare an eventual a4 push. Rook moves, again this bishop. And after quite a bit of maneuvering around, Nakamura finally starts to make a lot of progress on the queen side with the aggressive advance a3. Okay, no progress yet, but let's see how Nakamura is able to play this. And notice his patience. Radjabov kind of slipped up because he was not patient enough. And here we can see Nakamura just going back and forth, making small improvements, kind of seeing if Radjabov will mess up, maybe burning some time off the clock as well. So finally, Naka grabs this pawn and goes for something in the position. After rook takes h4, Nip comes back. Now we have quite a chaotic potential. Now we have quite an imbalanced position where white has 3 pawns on this side of the board, black has 2 pawns on this side of the board, but the problem is that white's pawns are just so much stronger than black's. So after a check, king comes up, rook slides over, Naka begins to push. c4, check, king comes up, and the pawns are marching up the board. Black tries to push his own pawn, but it's not going to be enough with white's king right here to defend. And finally, now there's a bishop hanging, and here, Radjabov decides to give up the bishop, putting all his hopes on this pawn. This pawn, however, is not going to make it to the finish line. Nakamura takes care of it with the knight coming back to defend after a few checks. And now that the pawn is well under control, it is Naka's turn to start pushing his own pawns. And he brings the knight back into the attack since white's king is more than enough to stop this pawn. Now black's king is stopped from coming into any of the squares. And finally, Radjabov resigned. The knight will eventually come to help the a-pawn promote. Nothing Radjabov can do about it. The game between Nepomniachtchi and Caruana was our clash between the two players who got a win in the first round. It was an Italian opening where Caruana very quickly adopted an aggressive approach, pushing forward his kingside pawns against Nepo's castled king. And as we'll see right now, here's where the pawn pushes start, while Nepo counters on the other side of the board with b4. Now attacking f2, defending, brings the queen over, and now Fabi drops back the queen to give his knight an escape square if it's attacked. After Nepo brings over the knight to g3, this is a common maneuver you'll see in these types of positions. Now, Fabi might do the same with his own knight, and here it's time to come up with a plan if you are Nepo. So what would you do with white here? So the big factor in this position is the fact that black has pushed these pawns in front of his own king. And if you saw yesterday's recap, you'll know that we talked about that quite a bit since it was the same feature that we saw in Fabi versus Naka from yesterday. The difference here is that Naka's king, when he pushed these pawns, Naka's king ended up being wide open. Here the position's very close, so it's going to be difficult for Nepo to bring over the pieces to attack. So how can we open up the position? Pawn d4. Going to open the center. Fabi tries to grab this pawn, but Nepo just gives it up. Going to slide the rook over, grabs the pawn, and after h3, forcing the knight away, bishop drops back since it was attacked. Fabi now plays c5, and here again, we can see black's king is potentially exposed, but at the same time, Fabi does have 2 very strong pieces in the center. Now after a trade, rook b3, Fabi plays b5. If you take on b5, you'll be opening up the a8 rook, but if you don't take, then as we'll see in a few moves, Fabi is going to grab that a4 pawn. So after these couple moves, king gets off the diagonal of the bishop. Now Fabi grabs the pawn, rook slides all the way across the board, king gets off that dangerous line, and queen d1, and over the next few moves, we'll kind of see the attack start to peter out from Nepo since the dangerous knight is removed. And finally, right around here, Nepo tries to bring in the queen, but it's hard to add many more attackers to the g5 square since black has it well defended for now. In the game, they ended up repeating as Nepo went for bishop b2, rook came over to e8, bishop b2 attacking there, rook came to e8, and they just went back and forth, bishop attacks, rook defends. In the game, though, going back, Fabi did have one potential chance in this position after bishop b2. So see if you can think about what Fabi could have done here. So this was a very difficult line, and part of the reason that Fabi didn't see it is that there's one move towards the end that's very difficult to see in advance. The right move is to get rid of this dangerous bishop by sacking the rook. Now the next thing is again difficult because a3, it looks like it helps white move their rook to attack f7. But black's idea is they'll take the f2 pawn, force the other rook to move over, and here is where there was a strong move that was likely missed. d5. You open up the queen to provide lateral defense to your a6 pawn, and you blunt white's bishop. The pawn cannot be captured because of the devastating queen d6. White has 5 pieces on the board, 2 rooks, a bishop, queen, and a king, and literally over half of them are being attacked by just one queen. So this would not have been what Nepo could have done. So this line would have given Fabi an advantage to potentially play for a win, but in the game they agreed to a draw. It makes sense if you don't see this line that you wouldn't be able to play this line. Yeah, if you don't see the line, you can't play it. Makes sense. In the game between Duda and Ding, we see an Italian opening where we see basically a lot of standard moves. All of this is standard theory that has been played many times in high-level Grandmaster games before. A5 has two ideas, dropping the bishop back potentially where it won't be in the way of any of white's pushes, and also preventing white from gaining queenside space with b4. Both sides now gaining control over the g4 and g5 squares, and we see some standard maneuvering. White avoids this trade, and now Ding goes for an interesting maneuver where he brings the queen over to the queen side, going after the f2 pawn, and now finally the queen's maneuver is complete and it has forced white to give up the bishop pair. In return for giving up the bishop pair, though, black does have these doubled pawns. So now Duda plays bishop d2, finally departing from quite a few top-level grandmaster games, but the position still remains around even. After bishop b6, queen comes up, and both sides just maneuvering a bit in this type of closed position. c4, white's idea is to clamp down on the central squares and open up the bishop to attack the queen. Queen moves away, bishop c3, and here Ding makes an interesting move. He goes knight g8, allowing the f-pawn to help fight for the center with either f6 to play solidly or f5 to go for an aggressive plan. Now rook d2, and here is our one moment where I'll ask you, what would you do with black? So the important thing is after white plays rook d2, you've got to ask yourself, why did they make that move? Duda really would like to consider pushing this pawn at the center, so Ding shuts any hopes of that down with the move c5. And now, after a few maneuvering moves, neither side was able to make much progress thanks to Ding Liuan's just absolute behemoth of a pawn center. Rook e2, both sides moving around. G5, again, it's okay to push your pawns in front of the king, especially if you're Ding and you have the center close. Because if you're not Ding, this can just easily backfire. Even if you're not good, this can easily backfire, as we saw yesterday. So, both sides just moving around a bit more. White tries to open the b file, but it's not enough for a significant advantage. And here, white might be able to claim a slight edge thanks to their more active rook, but in the game, Ding was able to play f5, and with that break, he was able to equalize the position. Rapport against Firouzja. Let's see how this game goes. We start with the Sicilian defense, Firouzja signaling his intention to once again play aggressively with the black pieces. Rapport, though, goes into somewhat of a sideline by recapturing with the queen and going ahead and just grabbing this knight. And interestingly enough, after Rapport creates this bind, we'll see in the next few moves that this game should remind you of one of the games you saw in yesterday's recap. It looks almost just like the game Duda Rapport, except where Rapport was on the black side of this position after a c5 breakthrough. There, it seems that Rapport has learned from what happened yesterday. Even though he held a draw, he was in quite some trouble during the game. Now, Firouzja definitely cannot capture on c5 because after a trade and Rapport grabs e5, this pawn structure is just an absolute mess. So going back, still though, pawn structure not so good for black. The c6 and a pawns are weak, but Firouzja is hoping that he will be able to keep those pawns under enough defense to make it so that he'll hold a draw. So both sides maneuvering their pieces around a bit. And eventually, now we start to see some action where Rapport trades, gets rid of the bishop pair, and tries to improve his pieces, attacks the b4 pawn, and now starts to open things up. So after a trade, Firouzja wants control of the a file, some more trades, and now, finally, Rapport has made progress getting in the rook to b7. That rook is extremely strong, but right now, still not enough for a win until Firouzja slips up. See, the problem is that while Firouzja tries to activate his own rook, he lets Rapport double on the 7th rank, and these rooks are just going to be dominant. This is a winning position for Rapport, but the win is so complicated that even the computers were having trouble finding it. The computer in this kind of thing likes to just try and recommend that one side keeps moving their rooks back and forth, and so even though Rapport was able to create a passed pawn, both sides have a pawn that can potentially run up the board, making things very difficult. And so around here, Rapport did mess up a bit and lost some of his advantage, but because of how complicated it was, I'm going to wait until Rapport misses his last chance to find the win. So we have a bit of shuffling back and forth. This is important because now black cannot push their d-pawn without hanging their e3 rook. So some more back and forth and back and forth, back and forth. And finally, something happens where now white pushes the pawn, black tries to stop it. Some more checks, some more checks. And here, Rapport finally misses his last chance to win this game. So white to move, what would you do? This is by no means an easy position. Rapport only had 20 minutes left to figure out what to do here, and he was not able to find the correct continuation. The right move, though, was started with king f5. White needs to activate this king, and by bringing the king closer, white is potentially making some kind of mating threats by stopping black's king from running out in some situations. Might look a bit far-fetched for now, but you're going to see what I mean. Black can try to run with the pawn, but now white needs to re-coordinate these rooks. That means bringing the rook back, where it's going to help defend against the pawn promoting, and is going to help check. Now there are threats of rook there and rook there. That's why the king needed to be on f5. Black has to kick the king away. Now there's a threat of both taking the rook and rook h8, potentially in the air. So how can black defend against both threats? One possible way for black here is to play rook h7. A very tricky move. Should you take this rook? Did Firouzja just give you a free rook? If this were to happen in the analysis. Not quite, because after takes, Firouzja would play rook e1. And the point is that you can't stop the pawn from promoting anywhere. The only move would be to give a barrage of checks after rook h8 and just keep chasing the king. So what would have happened, though, is rook g6 would help Rapport win. And after king h8, Rapport could play rook d1, and this is the end of the line where white has a winning position. Either the e or the b pawns are going to start running up the board, and white can corral the d2 pawn by bringing the rook back to go rook g5, rook d5, and finally take that pawn. That being said, definitely not an easy line to see. A lot of difficult moves there, so you can hardly blame Rapport for missing this chance. In the game, Rapport, instead of bringing the king up with king f5, played b4, but now the game was equal, and the game goes into a draw after the rooks are traded, some more trades and simplifications, and eventually we reach this position where the players agreed to a draw. White's problem is that the king is just way too far away to be able to help the pawn, and the position is equal. For the standings, we have Caruana and Nepo tied for first, Rapport, Firouzja, Duda, and Naka all with 1 out of 2, and finally Ding and Radjabov at the bottom. Tomorrow, we've got Firouzja against Naka, Fabi versus Duda, Ding against Rapport, and Radjabov goes head-to-head with Nepomniachtchi. I think one of the big stories of this round is the endgame with Firouzja. A lot of people give Firouzja some grief for his endgame play. So what do you think? Tell me in the comments. Is this a good or a bad sign of what might happen to Firouzja in the endgame in the future? He was in some trouble, but did manage to squeak out with a draw here. So let me know. Other than that, if you enjoyed, please like the video, subscribe, share,